Right now, tankers the size of skyscrapers are sitting motionless in open water, engines idling, crews waiting for orders that may never come, because the world's most important stretch of ocean has become a shooting gallery. This is the Strait of Hormuz, a channel so narrow that at its tightest point ships pass within about 3 kilometers of Iranian territory on one side and Omani territory on the other. Through this gap, before this war began, roughly 1/5 of all the oil consumed on planet Earth used to move every single day. Not 1/5 of Middle Eastern oil, 1/5 of global oil. And for months now, that flow has been under direct, repeated, deliberate attack. The war that broke this artery did not start with the strait itself. It started on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a joint military campaign against Iran aimed at its nuclear program and its military infrastructure. Iran's response did not stay confined to its own borders, and it did not stay confined to missiles fired at Israel. Tehran turned to the one lever it has always known could bring the entire global economy to its knees, the strait that sits at its own front door. By March 4th, Iranian forces had formally declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. An Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps official put it in blunt terms that were reported at the time. The strait is closed, and if anyone tries to pass, the Revolutionary Guard Navy will set those ships ablaze. Within days, that was not just a threat. The United Kingdom's Maritime Trade Operations Center had already logged 10 separate attacks on commercial vessels by March 8th, with crew members killed on more than one ship. This was not posturing. Ships were burning in the water. What followed over the coming months was not a single dramatic closure and reopening. It became something more corrosive, a slow, grinding war of attrition against the idea that this waterway is safe at all. Iran mixed drone strikes, ballistic missile fire, and fast attack boats to threaten and hit vessels attempting the transit. Insurance markets responded the way insurance markets always respond to genuine danger. Coverage for ships attempting the passage became either unavailable or so expensive it made the voyage financially irrational. Seafarers themselves, the actual human crews, who have to sail these tankers, became unwilling to make the trip. When you combine no insurance with no crew willing to sail, you get an effective closure, whether or not a single mine has been laid across the channel. That is the definition analysts have been using since the spring, that the strait is effectively closed, not because it is physically blocked end to end, but because functionally, nobody can move oil through it safely. The price chart tells the story better than any statement from any general. In the earliest days of the crisis, in March, Brent crude spiked above $114 a barrel, a level the market had not touched during the entire Ukraine war. Then, briefly, when reports emerged that Washington was considering direct military action to physically reopen the strait by force, prices crashed nearly 9% in a single session, tumbling toward $86, as traders bet that American intervention might restore the flow of tankers. That is how volatile this has been. Not weeks of gradual drift, but single overnight swings of 8 or 9%. The kind of move that used to happen once a decade and has now happened multiple times in a few months. By late March, with diplomatic gestures overshadowed by fresh disruptions, crude surged again, this time more than 5% in a single session, topping $99 a barrel, its highest level since the summer of 2022. The Revolutionary Guard was turning away Chinese vessels and watching a Thai-flagged cargo ship run aground trying to navigate around the danger zone. Analysts at the time noted that even a brief passage of 10 tankers didn't change the underlying picture. The effective closure of the strait was still choking about 1/5 of the world's energy flow, and American benchmark crude was already up 40% since the war began. Washington's answer, beyond airstrikes, was a naval blockade of Iranian ports near the strait, reinstated in mid-April specifically to choke off Iran's own oil exports, which had continued running at around 2 million barrels a day, even as the wider conflict raged. That blockade turned the strait into a two-way siege. Iran trying to stop the world's tankers from passing safely. The United States trying to stop Iran's own oil from reaching buyers. Two blockades layered on top of each other in the same stretch of water. Through the spring and into summer, there were moments that looked like relief. In late June, oil prices fell sharply, with Brent dropping more than 4% to settle near $72 and American crude sliding under $70. The first close below that level since February, as more tankers began exiting the strait and easing the immediate supply panic. But that calm did not hold, and it never really could, because the underlying dispute over money, over enforcement of any ceasefire, over who actually controls passage through the strait was never resolved. Even as prices eased, one energy analyst's comment from that period captured the mood better than any headline. Nothing has really been resolved, and Iran knows it holds the world economy hostage if it decides to shut the strait down again. That warning proved accurate almost immediately. Within days, a U.S. official confirmed Iran was behind an attack on a cargo ship near the coast of Oman, right in the strait's approach waters. President Trump, in a direct social media post, accused Iran of violating the ceasefire with drone attacks. describing how American forces had knocked down 3 of the drones involved, but that damage had still been done to the vessel before it managed to continue on its way. He called it, in his own words, a foolish violation of the ceasefire agreement. Whatever ceasefire had existed was already fraying in real time. Then came a new front entirely. Iran's allies in Yemen, the Houthis, declared their own maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia. This mattered enormously because Saudi Arabia had been using an overland pipeline to move millions of barrels a day to a Red Sea export terminal specifically as a workaround, a relief valve that let Saudi oil reach the market without ever touching the dangerous waters of Hormuz. The moment the Houthis threatened the Red Sea Route 2, that relief valve came under direct threat. Brent jumped again, gaining more than 1% to close above $89, as the market absorbed the reality that the crisis was no longer contained to one choke point. It was becoming 2. By the second week of July, the United States had entered a sustained bombing campaign against Iran. Not isolated strikes, but consecutive nights of attacks specifically targeting Iran's ability to threaten shipping. On July 13th, Brent crude climbed more than 4% in a single day, hitting its highest level since June 22nd, after the U.S. Central Command confirmed it had carried out dozens of strikes to, in their words, degrade Iran's ability to attack vessels in the strait. That round followed an attack on a Cyprus-flagged container ship, the GFS Galaxy, which Iranian forces had struck while it was transiting the strait. 4 days later, on July 17th, Brent rose again, gaining more than 4.5% to close above $88. This time after Kuwait reported that Iran had struck a power and water desalination plant on its territory as the fighting spread beyond ships and into civilian infrastructure. That same day, U.S. Central Command confirmed its 6th consecutive night of strikes against Iranian military logistics and maritime targets. Consecutive nights, not a one-off retaliation, an ongoing campaign with its own numbered count, night after night after night. 3 days after that, on July 20th, Brent climbed again to just above $89, more than 1% higher, after President Trump vowed that Iran would, in his words, pay for killing American service members, following renewed Houthi threats against Saudi shipping. And by the middle of this week, crude had surged again, jumping 4% to above $87, its highest point in 6 weeks, as the campaign reached its 11th consecutive night of American strikes on Iranian military facilities. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated publicly that Washington remained open to a diplomatic solution, but insisted that any future agreement would have to guarantee freedom of navigation through the strait and prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons or continuing to support militant groups elsewhere in the region. As of this most recent reporting, the strait itself remains formally open to traffic, even as American forces keep striking to try to keep it that way, and even as the danger spreads outward, with renewed attacks now hitting the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal on Russia's Black Sea coast, a completely separate export route for Kazakh crude that has nothing to do with Iran directly, but is now getting pulled into the same web of energy anxiety. So what does 11 consecutive nights of strikes actually tell you? It tells you that whatever the strategic goal is, degrading Iran's capacity to threaten shipping, it has not been achieved with a single overwhelming blow. It has required a sustained, grinding campaign night after night, and Iran has kept responding. That is the shape of this conflict now. Not a knockout, but a war of exhaustion, fought as much through tanker insurance premiums and barrel prices as through missiles. Step back and look at why this one waterway carries so much weight. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, with Iran along its northern edge and Oman along the south. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, in the first quarter of this year alone, before the war even began, the strait was carrying about 20 million barrels of combined crude, condensate, and refined products every single day. That is close to 1/5 of everything the entire planet consumes, moving through a channel so constrained that in places it narrows to just a few kilometers of navigable water. Saudi Arabia alone was moving more than 5 million barrels a day through that gap, making it the single largest exporter dependent on the strait staying open. The Energy Information Administration's own language on this is stark. Very few alternative options exist to move oil out of the strait if it is closed, and even a temporary inability to transit a major choke point like this one can create substantial supply delays and drive global energy prices higher. That is the mechanical reason a war fought in one relatively small stretch of Gulf water can move prices on every continent within hours. There is no simple detour. Saudi Arabia has its Red Sea pipeline workaround, and that is now under threat from the Houthis. The United Arab Emirates has a smaller pipeline bypass of its own, but neither can absorb anywhere close to the full 20 million barrels a day that normally moves through Hormuz. When the strait is dangerous, the world doesn't quietly reroute. It panics, prices spike, and then everyone waits to see whether the next round of strikes calms things down or blows them wide open again. And that panic does not stay contained to oil traders watching screens in London and Singapore. It moves through the entire economy. Every liter of jet fuel, every gallon of diesel powering a freight truck, every input into plastics and fertilizer and shipping costs, all of it is priced off the same crude benchmark that has been swinging by 4, 5, even 9% in single trading sessions since March. Analysts pointed out back in April that new American shale production, the traditional swing factor that can respond fastest to a price shock, has actually been slow to respond this time, with rig counts holding roughly steady even as fracturing equipment utilization ticked up modestly in the Permian Basin. In plain terms, the fastest possible source of new supply has not surged in anywhere close to the way it did during past oil shocks, which means the market has fewer safety valves this time, not more. There's also a deeper, longer-term shift happening underneath all these daily headlines. One of the sharpest lines from the analysis coming out of Washington policy circles this year is this: the risk profile of every single Persian Gulf oil producer is now permanently different because the world has watched Iran demonstrate repeatedly across 5 straight months that it has both the will and the means to make this choke point dangerous whenever it chooses to. That is not a one-time shock that fades once this particular war ends. That is a new baseline risk premium that will sit on top of oil prices for years, because buyers, insurers, and shipping companies now know this can happen again. Which brings us to the question everyone actually wants answered. Does this end, and how? The honest answer, based on everything reported through this week, is that it has not ended yet. And the pattern so far has been escalation followed by partial de-escalation followed by fresh escalation on a roughly 2 to 4 week cycle for 5 months running. Ceasefires have been announced and then violated within days. Diplomatic openings have been floated by Washington, even while airstrikes continued nightly. Rubio's own comments this month capture that contradiction perfectly, an openness to a diplomatic solution stated in the same breath as the 11th consecutive night of bombing. What would it actually take to break this cycle? Based on the pattern of the past 5 months, 3 things would need to happen together. First, a durable agreement that Iran itself would need to actually honor, not just announce, because previous ceasefire language has already been violated by drone attacks that President Trump himself called out directly. Second, some resolution to the Houthi threat against the Red Sea route, because as long as Saudi Arabia's own workaround pipeline is under threat, there is no safe alternative route left for the region's largest exporter, and that removes the one card that could otherwise ease pressure even while Hormuz itself stays dangerous. Third, and this is the part that gets the least attention in daily headlines, some kind of insurance market recovery, because even if every gun fell silent tomorrow, tanker owners and their crews will not rush back into a strait that has already seen fatal attacks on multiple vessels since March. Not until confidence rebuilds over weeks or months, not overnight. Until those 3 things align, expect exactly what you have seen for 5 straight months: sharp spikes on bad nights, partial relief on quiet ones, and an overall price floor sitting meaningfully higher than it stood before February 28th. To understand why Iran keeps reaching for this specific weapon, it helps to look back nearly 40 years, to the final stretch of the Iran-Iraq War in the late 1980s. Back then, with the ground war stalemated, both Iran and Iraq turned to attacking each other's oil infrastructure and tankers in the Gulf, an episode history remembers as the Tanker War. Iranian forces laid mines throughout the Persian Gulf, including inside the Strait of Hormuz itself, and international navies, including the United States, ended up escorting tankers through the region just to keep basic commerce moving. The parallel to today is not subtle. It is the same government using the same geography, the same narrow channel as the same kind of pressure valve, whenever it calculates that hitting the world's energy supply is more effective than hitting a military target directly. The tools have changed. Drones and precision missiles instead of naval mines laid by hand, but the underlying logic that Iran's greatest leverage sits in its own coastal waters rather than on any battlefield has not changed at all. That logic is also exactly why this crisis behaves differently from a normal war. In most conflicts, market attention narrows over time as investors grow numb to the headlines. This one has done the opposite, because the target is not a city or a border. It is the physical mechanism by which the entire planet gets its energy. Every trader in London, every refinery manager in South Korea, every fleet operator in Rotterdam is watching the same narrow strip of water, because a single successful strike on a single tanker can move prices faster than almost any economic data release. That is the actual definition of a choke point, a place where a small, localized event produces a large, global consequence, instantly, with no time lag for the market to absorb it gradually. The knock-on effects extend well past the price of a barrel of crude. Shipping insurers, who spent decades pricing Gulf transits as a routine, low-risk line item, have had to completely rebuild their risk models for this specific stretch of water. Freight rates for the tankers still willing to make the run have climbed alongside the war risk premiums attached to them, because ship owners now have to compensate crews and cover coverage costs for a voyage that used to be treated as unremarkable. Buyers in Asia, who depend heavily on Gulf crude for their refineries, have had to weigh paying that elevated price against diversifying toward alternative suppliers in West Africa, the United States, or Latin America, none of which can fully replace the volume that used to move through Hormuz on a normal day. And because oil is priced globally rather than regionally, none of these adjustments stay contained. A refinery outage or a rerouting decision made in Singapore shows up within hours as a price move felt by a driver filling up a tank in Ohio or a factory in Germany paying more for the diesel that powers its delivery trucks. There is also the question of who benefits, because not every producer is hurt equally by a crisis centered on one specific waterway. Exporters who can move oil without ever touching the Gulf, producers in the United States and parts of Africa and Latin America, have found themselves with a structural advantage for as long as this war continues, since their cargoes carried none of the war risk premium attached to anything passing near Iranian waters. That has already begun reshaping trade flows in ways that may outlast the conflict itself. Because once a buyer builds a new relationship with an alternative supplier out of necessity, that relationship does not always disappear the moment a ceasefire is signed. Wars end. Supply chains, once rebuilt, tend to stay rebuilt. The Strait carries a fifth of the world's oil. It has now also become the clearest single barometer of how far this war between the United States, Israel, and Iran is willing to go, and how much of the global economy is willing to absorb the cost of finding out.